Richmond, Virginia, February 1864. The Civil War was raging at its deadliest pace. The Confederate capital stood proud, but inside its heart sat one of the most dreaded prisons of the war. Libby Prison. 2 Union officers. The very name meant misery, starvation, and hopelessness. Libby wasn't built to be a fortress. It was just a former tobacco warehouse, converted into a military prison. Yet, its grim reputation soon rivaled that of Andersonville. Its high walls and watchful guards made one thing painfully clear. Nobody escaped Libby Prison. But in that winter of 1864, a group of determined Union officers decided to prove otherwise. They weren't content to waste away behind bars. They weren't willing to let disease and despair be their fate. Instead, they set their minds on something so audacious, so unthinkable, that it would later be called the Great Escape of the Civil War. Over 100 men would crawl through a narrow, hand-dug tunnel beneath the streets of Richmond right under the noses of their Confederate captors. This is the story of the Great Libby Prison Break, the boldest prison escape of the entire Civil War. To understand the desperation that fueled this escape, you need to step inside Libby Prison itself. Imagine a building meant for storage, not people. Cold brick walls, barred windows, and wooden floors that creaked with every step. Into this space, Confederate authorities crammed more than 1,000 Union officers, men captured from Gettysburg, and dozens of smaller battles. The conditions were appalling. Prisoners slept shoulder to shoulder on the hard floor. Blankets were scarce. Food was little more than a handful of cornbread and watery soup, and disease spread like wildfire. Dysentery, scurvy, and smallpox haunted every corner. There was no comfort here, no privacy, only endless hunger, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the gnawing sense that many would never see freedom again. And yet amid the despair, morale refused to die. The men whispered stories of home, shared scraps of news from smuggled newspapers, and sang songs to keep spirits alive. The human spirit, though tested, endured. Among them were men of vision and stubborn determination. Colonel Thomas E. Rose, of the 77th Pennsylvania Infantry, captured at Chickamauga, refused to surrender to hopelessness. Alongside Major Andrew G. Hamilton of Kentucky, he began whispering about a plan so bold it seemed madness. If Libby Prison could not be broken out of above ground, then perhaps it could be escaped underground. But how? With what tools? And without the Confederates noticing. The prisoners faced impossible odds. The guards were vigilant. The walls were thick. And yet, desperation breeds ingenuity. With nothing but pocket knives, spoons, and their bare hands, the officers began one of the greatest escape plots in American history. Before we get into the escape itself, let me share something with you. I've noticed that more than 80% of our viewers are over the age of 50. That tells me you belong to a generation that still treasures storytelling, that believes history is something to be passed down, not forgotten. And that's exactly what makes this tale worth telling. Because what happened beneath Libby Prison is not just an escape. It is a story of grit, determination, and hope that deserves to be shared. So if you enjoy these stories, I invite you to pass them along to friends and family, and help keep this tradition alive. And of course, a like and a subscribe will make sure we can continue bringing these forgotten Civil War tales back to life. Now let's return to Richmond, 1864. Deep inside Libby Prison, whispers spread among the Union officers. Colonel Thomas E. Rose and Major Andrew Hamilton had come up with a plan so bold that at first it sounded like madness. If the men could not break free above ground, then they would do the impossible: dig a tunnel beneath the very foundations of the prison. The idea was dangerous beyond measure. The basement of Libby Prison was a place few dared to linger, dark, damp, and crawling with rats. Confederate guards rarely went down there, but if anyone was caught, punishment would be swift and brutal. And yet, 4 men facing starvation and disease, the risk of digging was worth more than the certainty of routing in captivity. With no proper tools, the officers became inventors. They turned pocket knives, chisels, and even broken spoons into digging instruments. Wooden spittoons and old boots became makeshift buckets to carry dirt. At first, they tried hiding the excavated earth under floorboards and in dark corners of the basement, But that quickly became impossible, so they carried it secretly into the upper rooms, scattering it in fireplaces or stuffing it into the cracks of walls. Every handful of dirt removed was a gamble with discovery. The men dug in shifts, usually at night when the guards were less watchful. One officer would crawl into the tunnel headfirst, scraping at the soil, while others passed the loose dirt back behind him. The tunnel itself was barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through, stifling, suffocating, the air thick with dust. More than 11 the diggers feared the tunnel would collapse and bury them alive. What made it worse was the silence. They couldn't risk making noise. Every scrape of metal on stone, every muffled cough, could carry through the floorboards. Above them, guards walked their patrols, sometimes pausing, sometimes listening. At any moment, weeks of work could be undone by a single careless sound, but the prisoners pressed on. The tunnel stretched slowly, inch by inch, toward freedom. They aimed to reach a spot outside the prison walls, far enough away from guard posts to give them a chance at slipping into Richmond's streets unnoticed. The plan was ambitious. At first, Rose thought only a handful of men might attempt to crawl. But as word spread through the prison, dozens begged to join. Hope was a rare commodity in Libby Prison, and the tunnel became a lifeline of morale. By the time the digging neared completion, over 100 officers were preparing to risk it all. 4 weeks, Confederate guards had no idea what was happening beneath their feet. To them, the officers were beaten men broken by hunger, disease, and despair. What they didn't realize was that those same prisoners were clawing their way toward one of the greatest prison breaks in American history. It was the evening of February 9th, 1864, when the tunnel finally reached its end. After weeks of digging in secrecy, Colonel Rose and Major Hamilton declared the passage ready. The exit opened into a back alley near a canal, just beyond the walls of the prison. It wasn't perfect, the ground was muddy, the air was freezing, and Confederate guards patrolled nearby. But to the men inside Libby, that narrow crawl space looked like the gateway to freedom. One by one, the officers prepared to take their turn. There was no room for hesitation if anyone panicked inside the tunnel. The entire escape could collapse. Quite literally, the men stripped down their gear, carried only what they could manage, and crawled into the darkness. Imagine it. 100 grown men, officers of the Union Army, on their hands and knees in silence, inching through a narrow tunnel, no wider than a man's shoulders. The air was thick, the walls pressed close, and every scrape of cloth against dirt felt like thunder. At the far end, the first escapees emerged into the cold Virginia night, brushing dirt from their uniforms and quickly scattering into the streets of Richmond. Some hid in shadows, others moved with confidence, pretending to be locals slipping home from work. For a brief moment, Richmond, the very heart of the Confederacy, was full of Union officers moving like ghosts through its streets. But inside the prison, tension mounted. Each man's progress slowed the line. Guards paced above. The risk of discovery grew with every passing minute. By dawn, 109 Union officers had made the crawl. The tunnel had worked. The impossible had been achieved. But freedom was only the first step. Survival lay ahead. When morning broke on February 10th, Confederate guards realized something was wrong. Roll call numbers didn't match. Men were missing. Panic swept through the prison as word spread. The Yankees had escaped. The city of Richmond erupted in a manhunt. Soldiers, police, and citizens scoured the streets, canals, and back alleys. Patrols stretched out 4 miles beyond the city. For the Confederacy, this was more than an embarrassment. It was a direct insult. 100 Union officers slipping free from their very capital. The results were mixed. Of the 109 men who crawled through that tunnel, 59 made it safely to Union lines. 48 were recaptured and dragged back to Libby, to drown in the James River, their gamble ending in tragedy. For those who returned home, the escape became a badge of honor. They told their story with pride, not just of survival, but of unity, determination, and daring. Even in captivity, they had refused to be broken. The Confederates, humiliated, increased security at Libby. But the damage was done. Across the Union, newspapers hailed the escape as a triumph of ingenuity and courage. It became a symbol of hope, during one of the darkest winters of the war. And even today, more than 160 years later, the Libby Prison Tunnel escape remains one of the greatest prison breaks in American history, a story that proves the human spirit can endure, resist, and triumph. Even against impossible odds, the Great Libby Prison escape wasn't just a clever trick of tunnels and teamwork. It was proof that even in the darkest corners of the Civil War, hope refused to die. These men endured hunger, disease, and despair, yet they found a way to fight back, not with muskets or cannons, but with grit and determination. And that's why stories like this matter. They remind us that history is more than dates and battles. It asks the spirit of people who refuse to give up. Here on U.S. Civil War History, our mission is to keep these stories alive, to make sure they're passed down and not forgotten. If this tale moved you, I invite you to share it with your friends and family. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, so together we can carry these echoes of history forward to the next generation. Because in the end, the story of the Civil War isn't just about the past. It's about what we choose to remember and what we choose to pass on.